Our next talk is titled by Lourdes Baezconde Garbanati, and Yannis Rodriguez. We'll be talking about tobacco and e-cigarette retailers in California, part of the problem or part of the solution. That was mostly my idea for the title.
We have to kind of get right there, right? Right. Yeah. Oh. And then this way. Okay, great. Hey, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to those of you that are still hanging in there. So it's you know, I just came from the USC campus, and it took me an hour and 15 minutes to get here. So the traffic is really bad. So this is a better place to be. So Janice and I have been working on this project now for a few years, and we have been doing this work in the retail environment because we really believe that, you know, we have to look at the multiple aspects of addiction, and for us, the environment as well, it makes a difference. And the retailers who we see as part of the problem and as part of the solution are in that part of that environment that can make a difference, especially in terms of tobacco and e-cigarette sales. So this presentation in particular was put together by us as well as Riley Ransom and Steve Beckman, which some of you may know. Steve has been doing a lot of work in tobacco and drug abuse for many, many years. And this is a picture of our team. And as you can see, it's a rather large and very, very multidisciplinary and multi-ethnic team. And the reason for that is that we're working actually in 5 distinct ethnic communities, including American Indians, African Americans, Hispanic Latino, non-Hispanic whites, mostly of Armenian and Russian descent, and Korean communities. And so we really try to get expertise from all of those communities to really help us inform and help us in the process. So in this presentation in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about the FDA and the Tobacco Control Act, how that came about, which gave rise to funding for our project. About our project, I'm going to present information from 2 different projects, our retailers in the various ethnic community, as well as on Vape Shop, which is a lot of the work that Steve has been doing. And then just talk a little bit about our key findings. So to give you a little bit of background, the federal level regulated finally cigarettes back in 2009 through the FDA Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, which actually gave authority for the first time, if you can believe it, to the federal government to regulate the manufacturing, distribution, and marketing of tobacco products. So before 2009, that did not exist. One of the complexities of understanding how important the FDA Act was is not just how important it was overall, but it included provisions for American Indian and tribal lands, for example, which had never really been regulated. And so until 2009, it was really more optional whether the American Indian and tribal lands wanted to be part of the regulation that was imposed by the state or by the county. And it was through special deals and negotiations that happened. But when the federal government regulated it, then it became that they had to also abide by these federal regulations. And that became really a really critical piece in terms of curtailing tobacco use for all states. The scope of the FDA's authority, it gave it authority to regulate tobacco products, which is anything that's derived from tobacco and is intended for human consumption. Tobacco products do not include drugs or devices which are regulated under other kinds of provisions. So that's kind of it. And then out of the FDA, we were able to obtain through NIH funding for 14 different centers. And so our center is the one over here at the University of Southern California. There's another one with Stan Glantz, who is in San Francisco. who's done a lot of tobacco control and regulatory work, and other around the country. We're up for our renewal. We just submitted our renewal application. We don't know if we're going to get it because, you know, the environment is not the most conducive towards, you know, harder regulation, but less regulatory. And so we're not sure what's going to happen with those funds, but hopefully we have been competitive enough to maintain for another 5 years. So here I just wanted to showcase a little bit about the national youth and young adults and middle and older adult smoking and e-cigarette use prevalence so that you can get a feel for what it's looking like in these different populations. And what you see is that some communities have a much higher use of cigarettes as well as e-cigarettes than other ethnic communities. And what you see is that what we're seeing more recently is that even in communities where e-cigarettes were not prevalent in the past, now they're becoming more and more prevalent. So one community such as that is the Indian community, which really there were no distribution of e-cigarettes until the last couple of years. And then now those, that distribution has begun in earnest in those communities as well. Korean communities is another community where you do see e-cigarettes and see cigarette smoking as well. That has been some of the issues, especially among the older adult population. So who is vulnerable? So Janice and I thought we would show you this little video that was produced by the Tobacco Control Section for the state of California that really shows the importance of the work that we're trying to do and the reason why we do it.
Oh, maybe I can't hear it.
So this is Antonio's walk to school, and what it's showcasing is what Antonio sees on his way to school and what are some of the issues in terms of the environmental impact that might have.
Oh,
Oh, we're seeing it
sorry
here.
about that. I thought we were seeing. Oh, okay. Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
For every 254 kids. So why is that bad? Because tobacco companies place eye-catching ads in these stores, which influence our kids to smoke. And many of these stores are within 2 blocks of school. You may be surprised that research shows tobacco ads are more powerful than peer pressure. So you may not have seen tobacco ads lately, but Antonio sees them every day in his neighborhood, and is nearly twice as likely to start smoking. Stand up for our kids and protect them from a lifetime of addiction. Learn more about what you can do at tobaccofreeca.com.
It was over. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that.
The video is available online.
Well, we might be able to show it again, so let's give it another minute. It's only a minute long. Because I think it really showcases.
Oh, up here.
This is Antonio. He loves building things and solving puzzles. Antonio doesn't realize it, but there are companies who are after him. Antonio walks to middle school every day. Along the way, he passes by stores that have one thing in common. They all sell cigarettes and a lot of other tobacco products. In fact, in California, there's a store that sells tobacco for every 254 kids. So why is that bad? Because tobacco companies place eye-catching ads in these stores, which influence our kids to smoke. And many of these stores are within 2 blocks of schools. You may be surprised that research shows tobacco ads are more powerful than peer pressure. So you may not have seen tobacco ads lately, but Antonio sees them every day in his neighborhood and is nearly twice as likely to start smoking. stand up for our kids and protect them from a lifetime of addiction. Learn more about what you can do at tobaccofreeca.com.
So that kind of shows you, what's going on with the different communities and why we're trying to do this work. So I'm going to show you now a few slides that show what's happening with the various communities and really with our retailers' study. So our study tried to examine the knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs overall of the different retailers in these various communities. And here's our study design. It's a rather complex design because we have both qualitative and quantitative data, and we're using a mixed methods approach. And these are the maps of where we've been in California, and the map on the left is an overlay that you would overlay over the map of California to show you where the tribal lands are. Some of these tribal lands are, independent enough that they're saying that you should need a passport to go into them. So it's kind of like interesting in that way. The position of the retailers, we had several, mostly clerks, some of the managers and some of the owners in that store. These were the types of stores. They were convenience stores, liquor stores, so they were small, independent stores. And then we had a variety of ethnicity by the various communities. One of the things that I found to be most interesting related to some of our data is that we had many retailers in some communities that were of mixed ethnicity. And therefore, you had some retailers that were Korean who were in the African-American community, who then, were in charge of these environments. And that, Los Angeles, creates some kind of sometimes tension in these environments. And so we really looked a lot at how instruments and information was being translated, because we caught some mistakes in that translation, which really could have actually altered a lot of what was happening in those communities. So there were some issues of English literacy with some of our, retailers not really having a good dominance of the English language. There were issues of numeracy and also of literacy. This is the tobacco products that are sold by community, and as you can see, cigarettes and mentholated cigarettes and cigarillos are being sold quite a bit in the African American, Hispanic, and in the non-Hispanic white community in particular. Here you see the use of e-cigarettes and vapes, and how it is fairly large in some communities, and still, according to the industry, it's a good market where they could go into e-cigarette sales. These are E-Cigs and flavored e-cigarettes sold, and how they're sold in the different communities. And still you see a lot of targeting on the non-Hispanic white community in particular, but it's increasing in other communities as well. And this is e-cigarette self-service and free samples that are still available, especially in the non-Hispanic white community. Vapes and flavored vapes that are being sold, as you can see, this kind of tells you how it's being distributed among the various communities. And free samples are also being sold. So we have some issues in some of our communities. When we asked the retailers their opinion on e-cigarettes compared to combustible cigarettes, 32% believe that e-cigarettes were more dangerous than regular cigarettes, and the perception and safety actually differed by communities, with non-Hispanic whites and Korean community retailers being the most likely to report that e-cigarettes were safer than combustible cigarettes. And so we see these as opportunities for informing and educating retailers about some of the issues. 71% of the retailers believed e-cigarettes contribute to young people becoming addicted. So now we're about to go and launch a series of focus groups and potentially individual interviews to really understand if they really think that, these contribute to kids smoking, why are you selling them? And so that might be another kind of type of intervention program that we may be trying to look at and trying to understand what are some of the perceptions at the community level. There's some pre-deeming rule compliance, and Jen, if you want to mention a little bit about the pre-deeming rule.
Sure. So we looked at some of the areas that the FDA would regulate in the retail environment, such as we've already ban certain products, such as Camel Crush Gold, which is a very common tobacco product. But they also do not allow open cigarette boxes or cigarette packs less than 20, and this could also be translated to loosies, the single cell of one cigarette, and also that also relates to chew and self-service displays as well as free samples. And this is pre-deeming rule. They're in last year, the FDA did expand the scope of tobacco products, so now they do include e-cigarettes and other vape products in the deeming rule.
Which regulates.
Yes, so for our initial analysis, we just looked at the pre-deeming rule compliance. And out of the 775 stores that we were able to observe, 759 that actually, we were able to observe all of the variables that we included in the compliance analysis. And out of those, 8.4% were not compliant. And as you can see, there were more retailers in the African American community that were not compliant compared to other communities. We also looked at age verification. So part of the FDA regulation is that retailers have to ask for ID if a customer looks younger than 27 years old. And so out of the 775 stores that we were able to observe, 137 actually had a customer walk in that looked under 27 years old, and from those stores, 62% did not ask to see for ID. And this is actually really surprising to us, and this is actually even with us present, actually they know where they're present observing, but they still didn't ask for ID.
And the interesting thing about that is that when you see some of the data that's reported by even the state of California or nationally, it's really about 11% compliance. And so we're like, well, wait a minute, that's not what's going on in our own ethnic communities. It's a whole different story. And so that has become something of, that's really worth us exploring further, because, this is a fairly high level of noncompliance, especially with one of the most critical elements of enforcement, which is, selling cigarettes to minors. And so that does become one of the major issues. So these are some of the perceived barriers that the retailers see in terms of why they're not necessarily compliant, no access to educational materials. It's really interesting. From our data, we have tons of pictures that we want to analyze, so if anybody knows how to analyze the pictures, let us know. But you could see in the pictures very old signs, for example, and yet, the tobacco industry, their signs look really brand new and nice and beautiful. And so we're like up against, still, very powerful and effective industry. So in terms of our vape shop studies, I'm going to go a little bit quickly, but 32% of the reviews that were done in some of the things that we looked at in terms of the vape shop mentioned quitting smoking as the major reason for moving on to e-cigarettes. And 15% only were concerned about e-cigarette safety. Here's what the profile looks like in terms of who's buying e-cigarettes. The majority are males, and mostly in the non-Hispanic white community. And remember, those are in white communities, they're mostly Armenians, Russians, and people of Middle Eastern descent. Employee and customer handling of nicotine, about 50% allow the customers to sample e-cigarettes, and which is just such an issue. And they actually provide self-service sampling stations. Have you guys been into an e-cigarette shop? It looks like a bar, it's really cool, actually. So you should try to go in there and see what it is that we're talking about. If you're over 21 and your kids, this is what your kids are doing. So it'd be good to look at it. 76% of retailers believe that e-cigarettes in the vape shops were safer than combustible cigarettes, with about 1/4 believing e-cigarettes to be completely safe. And so, there's an issue there because we know there are non-safety issues. They even believed, a fairly large percentage, I think, that the e-cigarettes were better than the things that have been regulated by FDA to help people quit. So they thought that those were even more effective We don't have some of that data, but in another study by Adam Leventhal, he's actually showing how the e-cigarettes, a lot of people, especially among youth, it becomes dual use rather than just, quitting. And so that's also been part of the problem. Okay, so then to Dr. Friedman's question. Are the retailers part of the problem or part of the solution? Well, half and half. They're part of the problem and they're part of the solution. So we see them as vulnerable themselves because they're trying to make money and they have a lot of pressure from the industry to do that. They're in an incredibly dense regulatory environment where they're getting instructions from left and right, from the city, from the state, from the feds, and some of that information is not consistent. And the reason is because California, for example, now has laws that are more restrictive, right, than the rest of the nation. So it's like, well, is it 21? Is it 18? Well, who do I hear? And so I think that all of these organisms and, agencies, somehow our legislation needs to be consistent across the country so that we can actually make, big inroads into this because it's making even the retailers confused. They can comply with regulations. Many of them want to be in compliance because they do want to promote healthy environments, and they're very concerned about that. The educational materials that are being delivered to the retailers really need to be culturally and language appropriate, as you can see, because of the number of them that are from these various ethnic communities. And communities where language, English is not a primary language, it's not even a language that's commonly spoken at home. And so there are many issues to that. And so we have to set up the retailers for success, if we can actually work with the retailers to make them really a part of the solution. So that's kind of it for now, but stay tuned. We'll have more data coming and be happy to be back and tell you what progress is made. Thank you.
Questions? Are there any requirements that they're supposed to have educational materials in their
Well, they're supposed to have signage.
Age of self. Yeah.
But they don't have to say cigarettes are bad for you or like.
Well, not necessarily. However, I do believe that nicotine is considered a carcinogen and it's under Prop 64 signage. 64 for the carcinogens. Oh, sorry. The Prop 65 says you have to post when there's any carcinogens in the premise, and so some retailers have been told by the e-cig industry to place those Prop 65 notices on their products, but they are required for age of sale signs.